Hello everybody. Let's talk about some historical perspectives and motivation. This is where it comes from, and I know some people are not fans of history. I happen to enjoy history more and more, and I find the history of psychology and the evolution of these ideas just fascinating. You do know that Ohio State Psychology Department does have a history of psychology, so if this interests you, but we have to know where we've been to know where we are and where we can go. Penelope's here to join us, so she must have taken a nice long nap and now is ready to go. She is the most frequent visitor, so I'd be surprised if you oops, there we go. So she's going to do her thing. She loves this. I don't understand it at all, but so Penelope is daughter of Ursula, and we've adopted out a lot of Ursula's kittens. The last batch of Ursula's kittens before we got her spayed finally, or before we got rid of any males in the house, Ursula produced a lot of kittens. Penelope was not going to be given away. Nobody wants a one-eyed cat, right? At least most people don't. So let's talk about motivation in the historical perspective, right? What do we know? The historical view of motivation study helps us to consider, right, how the concept of motivation came to prominence, and we're going to tell some interesting stories about that. At least I think they're interesting. Would you believe that about a 20-year period of psychology, the dominant view was motivation didn't exist and it wasn't worth studying because it didn't exist? Motivation didn't exist. Psychologists. Wow, that was the cognitive revolution. More on that later. How it changed and developed, so our understanding of motivation over time. How ideas were challenged and how they were replaced, right? And then finally, how the field reemerged and brought together various disciplines within psychology. And I think both motivation and emotion have this beautiful ability to cause collaboration to be more desirable, and the synthesis of multiple perspectives and the interactions therein. So philosophical origins of motivational concepts, well, grand theory way back in the day, and we're talking 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Remember, what is the area of study that spawned psychology? What field, to which field does psychology really owe its origins? And it's philosophy. And if you doubt that, think about it. When I got my PhD, right, when I walked up onto that stage, in the winter of 2006, after 6 2/3 years of work, I get my PhD in psychology. I open that shit up, I look at it and it says, Doctorate of Philosophy. And I'm like, oh shit, they made a mistake. No. It's a doctor of philosophy, right? That's our ultimate origin, right? And we're still tight with that, right? So will and hedonism were theories. Epicureans were really wedded to, and that's at 300 BC or something, were wedded to the notion of hedonism, and people were exploring will previous to that. So these are the grand theories, and a grand theory is a simple theory that is meant to explain everything observed, and that's why it's called a grand theory. So, and then the second grand theory came along, and it was instinct. And why, when we want to explain why did they do that? Because, well, because they have an instinct that drives them to do that. And then the third grand theory came along, and now we're into the 20th century, and drive became the theory. And there's a lot of folks that talked about drive. Most notably, though, is probably Freud and Hull, so we'll look at both of those, right? The fourth grand theory then was more kind of maybe organizational oriented, and also had a lot to do with behaviorism. That is, that if you want to understand why people do what they do, you have to look at the incentive structure, their level of arousal, or in fact discrepancy in their needs will explain why we observe it. And from there, and the unsatisfactory power of the grand theories to explain all observations, we see the rise of mini theories. So the active nature of the person. We can talk about the cognitive revolution that began, let's say, maybe in the 1950s, and then applied socially relevant research that kind of made psychology a tad more practical and a little less theoretical. And then we'll launch ourselves into the contemporary era. So let's start talking about these, the grand theories then. This is the desire to have one statement that explains everything, and that's what the grand theory is, right? So, and it's the full range of human activity. So when we offer up the idea of will, the ancient philosophers understood motivation within two themes: good, rational, right? Immaterial, active, the will. So we have a will to do things, and willpower, right, and free will are notions that are explored, but they are used to explain all observed behaviors, right? And then there's the portion of us that's primitive, impulsive, or biological. So, and these then would be often tied to bodily arousal or bodily deficits, right? Now, instinct comes to us pretty early on, but really when we begin to look at Darwin, and Darwin was a game changer in Origin of Species and the theory of natural selection, right? The theory of evolution. The physiological analysis of the motivation by focusing on the mechanistic. What are the mechanisms? And the appeal of instinct doctrine had a great ability, right, to explain unlearned behavior. And we observed many behaviors that appear to be unlearned, right? And that had energy and purpose. Having cats and watching a lot of kittens be born, etc., almost immediately upon birth, after mom, kind of licks them and cleans them up, they're looking to nurse, right? And they have this strange ability, even when their eyes aren't open, to find a nipple and to nurse on it. This is not something that was learned, because there's no time to learn it yet. This is immediate. So we know that we call that an instinct, right? But to what extent are we going to use that instinct to explain the reason that I want to hang out with my friends? So we'll see. So these are goal-directed biological impulses, and there was an attempt to explain everything by them. Now, drive, the behavior was motivated to the extent that it served the needs of the organism. So there's a heavy physiological component to this, right? And it's usually has something to do with homeostasis. My stomach empties, and the fact that my stomach is emptying then sends signals that I should fill it back up, right? So let's first talk about will and hedonism. Thomas Hobbes, it was the root of incentive theory. And John Locke, will determine the desire rather than simple knowledge of goodness, right? So it thus expanded what became incentive theory from immediate to delayed gratification. So the ability to even delay gratification presents interesting problems. Jeremy Bentham, so we're talking what, 1700s here basically with these guys. The roots of affective forecasting and cognitive motivation. And these guys were blending in emotional response to environmental stimuli to this whole mechanism. Now, not a lot of ground was covered during this time. These weren't really useful kind of explanations. They were easily, exceptions were easily pointed out. And that's part of the problem, because I say, hey, this explains it, and then all you have to do is find one example where this doesn't explain it, and that theory starts to lose ground. It starts to lose explanatory power. Now, Conrad Lorenz was an interesting guy, and now we're into the early 1900s and beyond, and he says that we had an instinct to survive, and most people won't argue that. And survival is dependent upon access to food, and that requires territory. So Lorenz made a lot of noise about why animals defend territory, and animals, he explained, defend territory because territory represents food. So by defending territory, they defend their food source, and this allows for them to survive, right? So we instinctually defend territory. Now, the problem is, though, that why would perhaps a mother of an animal put itself in harm's way to protect their infant. And if the primary instinct is survival, then I should protect myself, not my infant, not my child, right? So what we see then is Cosmides and Tooby, when we get into the 70s and 80s, they're saying, you know what though? Could it be kind of this genetic imperative? That is, when we see a mother put herself at risk to defend her offspring, basically what she's doing is that could be explained that she's protecting her genetic material. That is, the future of her genetic lineage is not her, it's her children. So, but again, instinct then is this instinct to, have reproductive space and protect one's children. So, instinct was able to explain some observable behaviors. We could see hunting, fighting, nurturing are all instinctively driven behaviors in many species, and we say, hey, we're good to go. Now, McDougall, and one of the first social psychologists, right? I think he wrote the first textbook on social psychology, asserts we would be lumps of inactivity, right, without instinct. So instinct was absolutely imperative for us to even get up off our asses. Ultimately, it relies on genetic explanations, though, because where does the instinct come from? Well, it's our genetic legacy. So, but hey, instincts are the game, and we're often running with instincts. But as we step back and we say, but what and how do they explain? So let's take an example. A man is observed moving with a group of friends, and we say, well, he has a herd instinct. So we observe the behavior, and then we surmise that there's some instinct that underlies the behavior, and we give that instinct the name that really is related to the behavior we have observed. If a man is observed alone, he has an antisocial instinct. But now, what the hell is it? Which is it? And how do you explain then that one instinct operates in a certain given situation, especially in this example, and another instinct in another? That becomes difficult to do, right? And what happens though is now if every behavior has like an underlying instinct, think about the number of behaviors you could observe. And Bernard 1924, look, over 6,000 instincts were eventually observed. And notice now we explain nothing. Because every behavior has its own instinct, and we just make up a new instinct to observe, explain a new behavior. This is what we call a tautology, that instinct, behavior, instinct, but we're not learning anything. And there was often the statement that naming is not explaining. And we see a behavior, we name the behavior, we name an instinct, but we haven't really explained anything. So eventually it's replaced. It's run its course. There's been enough counterexamples that can't be addressed that instinct theory loses its oomph and kind of goes by the wayside. It's replaced. Now, John Watson, and you probably, hi Penelope, we all know about John Watson and Little Albert, right? And John Watson was of the opinion, tabula rasa, that we're born as blank slates. It's in the environment that affects us and then structures our motivational components. So it's through this process of classical conditioning that instincts could be redirected to novel stimuli. Notice this is essentially Pavlovian conditioning as well. So instinct becomes intertwined with external environment. Okay, so let's try this out here, and we're going to come on and take a look at Little Albert and John Watson. And when we do this, I found one way to do this is just for me to do this and go.
Little Albert was first exposed to things which he had not encountered before in his short life to establish a base response. They began with fire, followed by a monkey, a dog, a rabbit, and a white rat. Notice he reacts positively to all of these neutral stimuli, often reaching out to feel the animal. He seems particularly fascinated by the rat. When the conditioning started, he was startled and fell forwards, but he did not yet cry. The second time he reached for the rat and heard the noise, he started to cry. After much more conditioning, the rabbit produced immediate tears, but the dog only produced tears when close to his head. Pushing the experiment further, a fur coat was then presented to the little Albert, who became very agitated. By the end, even a Santa mask produced a fearful response in Albert's frantic retreat.
All right, Penelope, we got to get busy here. Come on. So as you can see, what John Watson is saying is, I can make this infant afraid of a mouse, a rat, furry objects, and then we discover that the fear generalized to anything that had similar components. This is not an instinctual response. This was a learned response, and Watson demonstrated it as such. Now, the downside is this is a horrible experience. This is amazingly unethical, and, there's a lot of backstory to this, too. Regardless, this is not something that we would do legitimately now in 21st century psychology. It would be considered absolutely unethical. So, but it does demonstrate the point that fears can be acquired, that fear is not necessarily an instinctual response. Wow. So, think about that. That was huge, and this is really the classical conditioning. So, where do we go from here? Well, let's move on, and let's look at Herbert Spencer and Clark Hull, and their suggestion is that drives are not instinctual, but they're based on deficits, that is, unmet needs. So to the extent that we enter into a need state and the need is unfulfilled, then we're driven to correct that imbalance to fulfill that need. So experimental rather than clinical perspective at its source, we can see that Watson is really kind of working from a clinical point of view, and now we're going to take it into the laboratory, and the deal is, what do we add to the picture? The understanding is prediction, and that's what a hypothesis is about. We say, look, I'm going to set up this situation and I predict this will be the outcome. And if the data, if the observation then meshes with the predicted outcome, we say that the hypothesis was supported. If the observation then is not consistent with the prediction, then the hypothesis is refuted, right? So prediction becomes key. We flip things around. That is, we set up a situation, we make a prediction, and see if that prediction is verified. So Hull was sometimes able to predict when higher versus lower levels of a drive would be demonstrated, and he was able to measure these outcomes. So this is huge, right? And this is really experimental psychology taking hold and moving to the fore. So drives are based on deficits, that is, unmet needs, and experimental rather than clinical perspective at a source is the way it goes. What we see then, the issue then, and often, are you sure you're not just teaching to the test? So drive and behavior, well, drive energized behavior, but it didn't direct it. And drive then, as far as Heb is concerned, is an energizer, not a guide. So remember that when we're talking emotion, we're talking about intensity, right? And we're talking about direction. Well, intensity could be explained by drive theory, but direction doesn't necessarily seem to be. If behavior is successful, it's likely to become habit, and it's ask any behaviorist. So again, we have difficulty necessarily explaining this. Learning and therefore environment become critical aspects in understanding motivation. And so we're firmly in kind of behavioral theory at this point. So at its core, drive reduction theory relies on the concept of homeostasis. That is, that an imbalance is created, and that imbalance is the motivating mechanism, that is, the imbalance needs to be corrected. So he believed that homeostasis was the motivational mechanism. The experimental results, inconsistent. And once you get results that are inconsistent, you have to step back and say, perhaps I'm missing something in my theory. There's a component that I have left out. But one of the most important features of drive theory was subsequent counter theories that developed. And that is, when I present a theory and the theory demonstrates weaknesses, people begin to explore those weaknesses and begin to expand our knowledge of what's going on. So Hull's drive theory then, here you go. E equals H times D times K. Fancy, huh? And this is when psychologists get into the math. What does this mean? Well, E is the excitatory potential. That is the strength of the behavior, right? Habit strength is the repetition or learned behavior. So habit is important because habits can be activated and have a motivational quality all of their own, right? K is the incentive motivation, right? And that is the external size magnitude of the goal. And then D is the drive. It's the internal amount of deprivation. So what do we know? Well, the excitatory potential, the strength of the behavior that we see, right? The intensity is a result of the habit, what's been done in the past, right? What is the motivational, what is the promise? What is the reward aspect? That's the incentive, right? And then the drive, to what extent have we been deprived? So the thirstier I am, that would be the drive, my level of thirst, right, changes the incentive motivation of a drink of a liquid. So the thirstier I get, that is, as D is going up, what that means is that K, the incentive of the liquid, becomes more and more desirable. It increases in its motivational power. So, 6-year-old girl who's hungry and wants candy is told that there's candy hidden under one of the books in the bookcase. The girl begins to pull out books in a random manner until she finds the correct book. They time this out to be 210 seconds. She's sent out of the room, right? And the candy is hidden under the same book. In her next search, she's much more directed and finds the candy in 86 seconds. By the 9th repetition, the girl finds the candy immediately in 2 seconds. The girl exhibited a drive for the candy, and looking under books represented a response to this drive. When she eventually found the correct book, this particular response was rewarded, forming the habit. On subsequent trials, the strength of the habit was increased until it became the stimulus response connection in this setting. So how habit is acquired and what happens. So then, let us kind of finish out this part with this then. So for E, for the formula, D, the longer it's been since one has had the cigarette, the stronger the drive becomes. And I hope none of you smoke, right? I spent years smoking. I haven't smoked in 10, 12 years, but before that I probably smoked 30 years of my life, right? So I know how this works. How important is the goal of the drive is K, and how ingrained is the habit? To what extent has one learned the success of the behavior? The smoking reduces the drive, right? So let's call it good for part 1 here, and we'll move on to part 2 with Sigmund Freud. And we're back for part 2. We've been discussing Hull, as you can see, and we can see that the intensity, the longer the time since I've smoked, right, then the more significant the drive will be, the more appealing the cigarette becomes, and the more my habit for smoking takes over, thus resulting in the smoking behavior. So, now, that was Hull and Spence, but we have, psychologists working different areas simultaneously. Let's take a look at Sigmund Freud's drive theory. And Sigmund Freud is certainly about drives. I mean, he specifically lists drives, right? And the mechanisms under which those drives operate. So for Freud, what we see is the drive source, the drive's impetus, the drive's object, and the drive's aim. So let's move through them. The drive source, let's say a bodily deficit occurs, right? Blood sugar drops, So a sense of hunger emerges. We'll talk later how that works specifically, right? The intensity of the bodily deficit grows and emerges into consciousness. Isn't that weird that I'm hungry and then suddenly I become consciously aware, oh shit, I'm kind of hungry, right? And this causes discomfort. And what Freud is saying is then we're driven to reduce the discomfort, seeking to reduce the anxiety, satisfy the bodily deficit, right? A person searches and consumes a need-satisfying environmental object. That is, in this case, food. And then the drive's aim is the environmental object successfully satisfies the bodily deficit, satisfaction occurs, the anxiety of being hungry then. And Freud uses the term anxiety. You might not be down with that term in this example, but close enough, right? For a period of time. Now note that a bodily deficit occurs, right? Now we can blow this into cognitive deficit as well, but further on Freud later on in the course. So, decline of the grand theories, will. Well, the philosophical study of the will turned out to be a dead end, explained very little. And about motivation as it raised more questions than it answered. That is, if we start doing studies based on will, we just generate too many questions, we never get anywhere. Instinct, right, the physiological study of instinct proved to be an intellectual dead end. And as I'd said earlier in the previous part of this lecture, naming isn't explaining. And then drive theory proved itself to be overly limited in its scope. So many behaviors really that it couldn't explain. And now we become disillusioned as a field, as psychologists saying, man, we're not getting anywhere. So let's compare then the thinkers, the mid-century thinkers, right? Top 10 most important historical figures in psychology, mid-century, 1950 or so, Sigmund Freud, Clark Hull, right? Right up the drive theorists are at the top of the list. Wilhelm Wundt, right? Developed the first psychology lab in the United States. Pavlovian conditioning, man. John Watson, look at them, right up at the top. Thorndike for his scaling efforts. William James in his big overview. Go through the list. Kurt Lewin, I'm sorry you're number 10, buddy. You're one of my favorites, right? But that's the way it was. But let's move into the latter part of the 20th century into the 21st century. And who do we see rise to ascendancy? Who's considered the 10 most important psychologists? B.F. Skinner, and his explanation of operant rather than classical conditioning, which has far more applications. Piaget, a cognitive psychologist, and we see cognitive explanations for behavior starting to arise. Sigmund Freud's still on the list for a lot of good reasons, but Albert Bandura comes in. And man, Bandura, one of the 10 most cited social psychologists, right? Leon Festinger, same camp. Huge levels of explanation. But now we're moving into the cognitive revolution. Staniel Schachter and Maslow. And you know about that guy Maslow. So we can see that there's a shift in the perspective of psychology over time, and a shift in the importance of certain theorists over others. So we're entering into the post-drive theory. We see the psychologists who are held in esteem change for the most part. So what do we see in the post-drive years? First, motivational study rejected its commitment to a passive view of human nature. That is, it's not whether we have will or not. It's not the instinct that's operating on us. It's not these biologically generated drives necessarily. That humans are active participants in their environment. So we have to have a more active view of human psychology, right? Motivation, second, right, turned decidedly cognitive and somewhat humanistic. So we have the cognitive revolution, but we have the positive psychologists, the humanists, coming online as well. And third, the field focused on applied, socially relevant problems. So psychology became less of an intellectual parlor game and more a means to an end, that is, improving the human condition. So if we look at incentive versus drive reduction, right, what are we talking about? External event or stimulus that energizes or directs approach or avoidance behavior, right? And note that organizational psychology, business psychology, is demanding more practical analysis. And you see here the carrot and the stick. Two ways potentially to move a donkey. You can stand behind the donkey and you can hit it with a stick or a whip or what have you. Not a very nice thing to do, but that should impel it forward. But come 1920s and 1930s, this metaphor was being used in business. You want to get a worker to do something, to work harder, stand behind them and yell at them, beat them with a stick, threaten them with dismissal, right? But you need to work hard to avoid getting fired, to avoid being embarrassed, to avoid being punished, to avoid having your... But someone said, you know what? There's another way to get a donkey to move. And that is you can stand in front of a donkey and hold a carrot in front of him and go, hey, you want this carrot? This is an incentive. This carrot is something you like. You want this carrot? Come with me and I'll give you the carrot. That is we start using incentive. No biting. You're being vicious now. All right. So drive reduction pushes, but incentive pools. And now, wow, fantastic times. We have two potential ways to motivate. That is, we can threaten people with punishment, or we can entice people with reward. Incentive and arousal. So, incentive then, unstimulating environment, is boredom. Overstimulating environment, anxiety. But optimal situation, optimal arousal, and optimal satisfaction at that point. So the optimal situation, finding that great situation, the best situation for me possible, is an incentive. So we search for a house that suits our needs, that feels like a home. We search for a school that will satisfy our needs. These are incentive elements and gain prominence in the study of motivation. Now, how many of you, and maybe some of you haven't seen this, this is 2311, so this is kind of a mid-level course. I think this is the only 2000 level course I teach. Well, no, because I teach social psych as well. But most of my courses are 4000 level. So I know that when you guys are coming at me from 4000 level, you've probably seen this a couple times, at least your psychology majors, right? And this is the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And it's applicable in a lot of different levels. But a medium level of arousal is the most pleasing, it's the most satisfying, and fascinatingly, a medium level of arousal is also where our best performance occurs. Right? So we see here that in fact, that medium level of arousal creates the best. And see, here's laid back, but motivationally, not much is going on there. But anxiety also diminishes motivation. And as I found yesterday, it was really hard for me to muster the motivation and the attention to get any kind of work done, given the circumstances of the Capitol building being invaded. So, let us then, and here is kind of an aside, if you will, of the scientific revolution, and that is Thomas Kuhn. And he says, what we see quite often is, for example, we're trying to explain our world in psychology through grand theories. So the philosophers and then the subsequent psychologists are saying, grand theory, we need a theory that explains everything. And boom, there's a paradigm shift, and I know that's a fancy word, paradigm, right? But what that means is our way of doing business. In psychology, we're not going to look for grand theories anymore. We're not going to invest our efforts in grand theories. We're going to move to smaller, more explanatory of specific behavior type theories. So that is, we're going to shift the way we look at our world. We're going to adopt a new paradigm that is laboratory, verifiable, testable, mid-range theories, right? So, this is when the paradigm shifts, and it's during these times of paradigm shift that we see the greatest gains in human knowledge, right? Because we realize the limitations of our old ways, and we start to explore new ways that release us from those limitations. And if you like the book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, you might want to check it out by Thomas Kuhn. He points out these different areas where these things happen. So, outline of the typical development of a scientific discipline then. The pre-paradigmatic, what do we know? The budding science emerges, and it consists of participants who do not share the same language, right? But what happens is these people then begin to communicate, and we begin to then develop a standard way of looking at things. And the standard way of looking at things... We might have had just a kind of glitchy break there. The camera cropped out, so We're going to sort through the technological difficulties, certainly at the beginning of the semester here. So, what we're talking about then is Thomas Kuhn. So I wanted to pick up kind of where we left off. And he really turned the world of science on its head. A lot of times we thought, well, this leads to that, and that leads to this, and this is how science evolves. But often science evolves as a result of being dissatisfied with current theories. And that's a huge point. So how does this fit in? Well, the pre-paradigmatic is when a field starts to coalesce, starts to come together. A lot of different opinions, a lot of different ideas on the way things should work. And through trial and error, we kind of hone in on this is the way we're going to do business. And that is the paradigmatic aspect, right? It really is the formalization of how business will be conducted in a given field. But then inevitably we see shortcomings, and those shortcomings need to be addressed. And this causes what Kuhn called a paradigm shift, or the adoption of a new paradigm. The gradual diminishing of the influence of one paradigm and the taking over of the new paradigm, right? And it brings the discipline changing progress, and this is why it's oh so important. And paradigm shifts can be kind of just natural evolutionary processes that occur out of dissatisfaction, but often paradigm shifts also represent the incorporation of new technology. Now, in the 1950s, we see from the 1940s to the 1960s, but especially in the 1950s in psychology, the cognitive revolution. So ideas like drive, motivation, etc. are replaced because we saw there was a lot of dissatisfaction with their ability to explain observed phenomenon. We see the paradigm shift in the cognitive revolution that in fact, we have these two competing assumptions that people are passive and motivation gets them off their butts, or people are naturally active and naturally curious explorers of their environments. So at this point in time, what we see is that most people favor the old paradigm, but the new paradigm has a couple devotees and they start to gain traction, right? And so the new view of the primary causes of behavior then, they say, well, expectations are a cause, what do we expect to occur, and is that expectation desirable? Might drive people towards or move people away from objects in their environment. Judgments and evaluations come to the fore, that people's judgment of a stimulus becomes all important. Remember the behaviorist idea of a reward versus a punishment. Okay, so a reward will motivate and will cause action to a behavior to reoccur, whereas punishments should diminish the prevalence of that behavior. Strangely, though, what constitutes a reward and what constitutes a punishment is really a judgment of the person. Some people may find one person's reward might be another person's punishment when you get right down to it. So judgments become important. That is, how do we evaluate these consequences? So judgments and evaluations become large in their explanatory power. Goals and goal setting becomes the object of analysis in the study of motivation. Thoughts, that is just cognitions and beliefs, are part of this as well. How do you get a couple thousand people motivated to mount an insurrection and break into the Capitol building of the United States? How does this occur? There must be some belief system that underlies that or demonstrate that this is the appropriate thing to do. And in our case, we can pin it largely and most easily, although remember, multiple explanations because of critical thinking. But there's obviously people who stormed the Capitol, essentially committing an insurrection, committing treason, right, on the basis of the belief that the election was illegitimate. And so that's what drove some of those people. Now, it may just be a desire to believe that, and that's where we get back to that idea of motivated reasoning that I floated before. But we see new faces, right? Like Harold Kelly, who's one of the leaders of the cognitive revolution. We see Yakov Trope, who really kind of intellectualizes it and deals in the power of goals. And then as it goes, that is, the graduate student learns from the professor, right? And then goes on to extend theories in their own. And we see Ken Fujita here at Ohio State in social psychology exploring the motivation motivating properties of unconscious or non-conscious goal pursuit, right? So these are, outgrowths of the cognitive revolution. And from the cognitive revolution, motivation wasn't sidelined, but it wasn't necessarily or desirable as an explanation. Motivation still existed, but they weren't willing to acknowledge it because it wasn't demonstrable in the laboratory. So they had to find substitutes for motivation. It wasn't until the 1990s, more on that later, where motivation reascended as a concept worthy of study. So, for the cognitive people, internal processes, cognitive constructs, beliefs, evaluatory systems, these all became important, while biological and environmental constructs were thought to be of lesser importance. But we'll see the shift swing back, right? The shift from a mechanical view of human nature to a cognitive view, also probably an outgrowth of wanting to distance human beings from animals. Now the humanists really took this another step further, that humans are inherently active, that humans are cognitively flexible, they can explore different avenues or different approaches, and humans are growth oriented. And when I say humans are growth oriented, who does that bring to mind then? If any of you have had positive psychology, right, or psychology of adjustment with me, then you probably started to consider these ideas that the humans are growth oriented. And Carl Rogers and Maslow both said that people have a desire, a motivation to self-actualize. That is to become who they are. And I know that sounds funny, but this is this power. And the power of this motivational process is captured in what Maslow says here, that a musician must make music, an artist must paint, right? A poet must write, if he's to be ultimately at peace with himself. And it's finding who we are and then behaving in a manner that's consistent with who we believe or experience ourselves to be that is really kind of the process of self-actualization. How is it that I left a very high-paying job, at the paper mill to pursue school full-time instead of going to school part-time, to give up that opportunity that I had to follow something that was not a clear-cut path? And then in getting into graduate school, teaching my first course, then self-actualization kind of came home and said, this is who you are and this is what you need to do, right? So finally, the paradigm shift, and let's go back to Kuhn here, right, is intervening in life. That is, we're dissatisfied with where psychology was previously. We want psychology to be more practical. We want psychology to be more useful. We want psychology to be more applicable. We understand the growth motivations and cognitive mechanisms. So we start saying, hey, can we intervene? Can we use psychology to make changes in people for the better? To help people make better lifestyle choices, to understand what's important to them, to promote the value of both physical and mental health, to pursue success in some manner that's healthy and especially psychologically healthy, right? What about school and this whole arena of school psychology? And I'll bet more than a handful of you are going to think about in terms of pursuing careers in school psychology or some kind of childhood interventions, educational interventions. What about the quality of life? How can we use psychology to live better? And that's become kind of a theme in psychology of adjustment, is we stick with Ohio State's 9 wellness dimensions throughout the course, trying to use what we've learned from psychology and self-exploration and self-management in a way that makes our life more fulfilling to us, right? We want to do something with psychology is really what this is about. We want to make psychology meaningful, not just an intellectual exercise, although I really enjoy that part of it, but then I'm a psychology freak, right? But I mean, for people who don't want to play those cognitive kind of games, but how do we make psychology useful? All right. And one way to do this, and one of the the results of the paradigm shift, was the rise of mini-theories. And mini-theories, and some people call them mini-theories, don't be confused though, my advisor Phil Tetlock called them mid-range theories, but these are theories that are amenable to hypothesis testing. That you can use these theories to craft testable hypotheses, and notice that these are theories and hypotheses that are much narrower, that want to explain very truncated types of observable behaviors. Like what? So we take a motivational problem, like the motivational phenomenon, the flow experience. So we concentrate on the flow experience. But notice, flow doesn't explain all behaviors. It explains a very narrow subset of behaviors that people engage in, where they lose a sense of time and they feel fulfilled through their participation. Or maybe we want to study particular circumstances that affect motivation, and especially self-researchers, people researching self-esteem and self-efficacy, developed laboratory techniques where they would provide people with failure feedback and see how that would affect them. And notice now we're in a very narrow theory, and what we see is that failure feedback is highly motivational to some. That is, motivates them to approach, to persist, and it motivates other people to quit when they receive failure feedback. So then we get to explore what's the difference between those people, or groups of people. How about extroverts? Theories about motivating, and how extroverts interact with their world, or motivating workers, right, to produce more, what have you. So the theories become smaller, but in so doing, they become more precise and they become more useful. Theoretical questions. What's the relationship between cognition and emotion becomes kind of the role of a mini-theory. What is the theoretical relationship between those two? We're not trying to explain the entire world of all of life or all of psychological experience. We're trying to, explain relatively narrow relationships or phenomenon. So an abbreviated list of the mini-theories. What do we got? Well, achievement motivation. So Atkinson is trying to explain what causes people to be motivated to achieve. What does an achievement motivation look like? Does everyone share in it equally? How does it affect behavior? Cognitive dissonance theory, right, is straight up motivational from Leon Festinger. That is, I do something, I commit a behavior that contradicts my values, and that causes a tension, and that tension needs to be resolved. That tension motivates me to employ dissonance reduction mechanisms, right? So narrow theories, right? Expectancy times value theory. Vroom, when we look at people in the workplace, so when we say, well, why do some people try to do this, or under certain situations, why are people motivated to proceed on a task, and why are some not motivated? And Vroom finds that, and we'll talk about this later in the course, like most of these, that part of the equation is my belief that I can do it, but even if I believe that I can do it, is doing it something that I want done? Is that desirable? So it talks to people's behavioral choices, perhaps in a workplace. What is intrinsic motivation and how does it affect us? We'll talk a lot about that, maybe even more than you want to. Seligman developed the theory of learned helplessness. He said, why do some people persist in a horrible situation without trying to get out of it? And he said these people, or animals were his original study, especially dogs, why do they not attempt to avoid a painful electrical shock? Because they've learned not to. They've learned to be helpless, right? Self-efficacy theory from Bandura. Bandura is one of the, 10 most cited people in psychology at this point. What is the belief that one can do something? How does that affect their motivation to actually pursue that? Self-schema theory by Marcus is this image, this story we tell of ourselves, our perception of ourselves, and how it relates to our behaviors in part. So we can see that this is just a partial list of mini-theories, but far more explanatory power. Far better predictions can be made on the basis of these theories as long as we're applying the right theory in the right situation. Okay, and it makes for work. I mean, it employs a lot of psychologists, right? So now, the motivation study in the 21st century, multiple perspectives, multiple choices are available to us. Core concept in this class, and should be in most of our psychology classes here at Ohio State, right? So we see that people from different fields have different contributions they can make to a larger picture. And it really says that Psychology is an interactive science. It's got many disciplines, but we learn the most when those disciplines collaborate and they interact. So the developmental people, the educational people, right? When we ask the core questions, what causes behavior and why does behavior vary in its intensity, are two critical questions. We get different answers in different contexts from people who study in different areas. But to the extent that we can collaborate, to the extent that cognitive psychologists will in fact work with biological psychologists and understand the interaction between what one thinks and how it affects their biology, right? Or health psychologists, right? And counseling, but not just, these are healthy behaviors and this is why they're healthy, but how do we promote these behaviors and move people towards these behaviors? Clinical psychologists looking at psychological disorder, and then, there's a whole level of personality disorders. I hope by now we've learned that putting people with narcissistic personality disorder in positions of power is a big effing mistake, right? Maybe we haven't learned. Industrial organizational psychologists, which I think is an outgrowth of social psychology, IO psychologists would probably argue, but social psychologists, the power of the situation becomes all important. And then you take socio-developmental psychologists like Erik Erikson, right, who explains lifespan development, but he has to take from developmental processes and social forces. So it's where these areas intersect that we probably gain the most knowledge and the best ability to predict. So when we look at the many voices in motivational study, and this is going to lead to your homework assignments, so that's why the homework assignment is going to be produced right after this slide. All right, let's look at these different perspectives. And as you move through your psychology career here at Ohio State, it's important, I believe it's fundamentally important to understand that there are many explanations possible. There isn't one right answer. The most important word, one of my favorite words on the planet, and you guys have had me in other classes, what's that word? Depends. And it's a fail-safe answer because, if we were face-to-face and I asked you a question, I said, what do you think? And you're always free to respond, it depends. Of course, the downside of using the response, it depends, what am I going to ask next? Right, it depends on what. And so it depends on a behavioral point of view or a neurological point of view or a social cognitive point of view. That all these different points of view tell a story, make a set of predictions, some better than others given the current context and what we're trying to explain. So behavioral people, they like to look at environmental influences quite often and the nature of rewards and punishments, consequences. And the neurological people are really at the brain level people, the brain level people. Neuroscience is the bomb right now. Physiological, one of the tools in their toolkit is explaining behavior through hormonal activity, among many others, right? Cognitive psychologists, mental events, thoughts, belief systems, and how they affect our behavior, our choices, our motivational states. The social cognitive people, ways of thinking, right? That guide people through their exposure to other people and how people influence each other, or how the presence of conspecifics affects our behavior. We'll talk about that with Dr. Science. Right? Cultural, and this is, pushing social psychology up to a higher level. How is that hidden hand of culture affecting behavior and affecting motivation? The evolutionary psychologists, right? They're usually asking the question, when they see a behavior, they say, what is it good for? How does it facilitate adaptation to the environment? Humanistic psychologists, this was the breath of fresh air that came through the 60s. We got a kumbaya, right, folks? What we're going to say now is people want to do the best that they can do. This is a natural state. And if people don't want to do the best they can do, what the hell is interfering with that? And we need to explore that. And then the psychoanalytical, bless Dr. Freud, Freud came at us and said, look, we have an unconscious mental life, and there can be conflicts that are, suppressed, repressed into the unconscious, and they have a hidden effect. They motivate us in strange and really mysterious ways until we dig down and get to the source of that conflict, bring it to the surface where we can explore it. Okay? So let's take a look at homework 1. Bottom line, There is no single explanation for observed motivational phenomenon. You observe a behavior, we generate a list of possible motivations, but not a single motivation, right? So multiple potential explanations, and we have to acknowledge that some are going to be better than others. The first step in critical thinking then is to develop or consider that list, right? And then say, okay, what evidence do I need to test this first explanation? What evidence is there that will support it or refute it? And then I go to the next explanation and run the same analysis. And then the next explanation. But overall, what we see is some explanations will ascend in their probability of being correct. Other explanations will descend in the probability of being correct based on the evidence at hand within that context with that person. Right? This is where we get really good at doing psychology, because we're engaging flexibly and using all the potential tools in our psychological toolkit to understand phenomenon, or if we want to go there, to shape behavior as an afterthought. So the assignment helps us, I hope this assignment helps us explore the first aspect of critical thinking, that is developing the list of potential explanations. So, as a team, you're going to share your phenomenon that we discussed in slides 19 and 20 from Lecture 1, the introduction. So what you do is you find some way to communicate with each other, right? So you can use some kind of group me or whatever mechanism you want to use so you guys can discuss, so you can collaborate, so you can share your ideas, right? Now, there's a hidden purpose to that. And there's a couple purposes. Number one, because many of us are starving for some kind of affiliation during this COVID pandemic, and you know, many of us staying at home, etc. I hope this facilitates some interaction and helps to fulfill affiliation needs for some people. That's part of it. Part two of this is, since we don't have exams, we're not generating a lot of points from exams, we're generating a lot of points from homework. But the problem with homework is, it is time consuming to grade. And that is, and what's happening is every time I turn around, they're increasing the enrollment in these courses. So the courses I teach now, you know, this course used to be 60 seats. Right now it's 160. So what we've done is about 2.5 times as many students. That's a lot of work to grade, especially if you can't just do Scantron exams, but you have to do homework assignments that you have to read, you have to correct. So my course assistants and I have to be practical about this. Using teams is a great way. Instead of grading 160 assignments, we can grade 40 assignments. So it's a practical solution to an organizational problem, right? I'd prefer to teach courses of 40 students, but university isn't going to do that, right? So that's why we're using teams. There's a lot of benefits, and ultimately a majority of people, I think, enjoy the experience. Obviously, there's going to be some people it doesn't satisfy. What's the old saying? You can't please all the people all the time. So what you got then is, as a team, share your phenomenon, your individual phenomenon, with your team members. So your team members all share the phenomenon that I asked you to record from the previous lecture. Once you share that phenomenon with each other, now you've got X number of phenomenons, choose one. As a team, decide, hey, let's go after this one. And now, once you've selected that single phenomenon, each team member chooses a different perspective from the previous slide, slide 37, right? Many voices in motivational study, from that one might use to explore, to investigate, and to explain the phenomenon. And the thing is, we know we can do this because there's multiple explanations possible for any given phenomenon based on the different perspectives. So each team member is going to explain their rationale for their choice. A short paragraph in length should do. This will be turned in as a single assignment. You'll see on Carmen in the assignment section in the module, right? You'll see the assignment fully fleshed out. And for many assignments, what I've supplied you is with a Word document that says a template. So you can open up that template in a shared space, and you guys can each fill in your aspect to turn in one single Word document. Right? That's what I want, and I want only one person to submit it The rest will take care of itself, and then we can find it, and when we grade it, we can assign credits everybody. So the previous prep then, I asked you to turn inward, maybe even journal your experience in the course. Remember this from the introduction. Part of the story of you. You're going to need this for homework 1, as I suggested to you. So this slide just, is so. And what was the phenomenon? So take us back to this point, right? What is its opposite? Where does it come from? Is it malleable or fixed? What does it relate to? What does it predict? Okay. The assignment then. Let me give you an example. Phenomenon chosen: I continue to argue with my significant other even when I know or at least suspect I'm wrong. I hate to do this to you guys. I'm going to take a break here. We're out of space, and we'll have to do a new file. And as promised, here we go, picking up. So we're fleshing out homework 1 here, right? Phenomenon chosen: I'm going to I continue to argue with my significant other even when I know or at least suspect I'm wrong. Why would I do that? Why would I double down, triple down, quadruple down? Why would I continue to argue when I know that I'm probably wrong? Now, there's a lot of potential explanations for what motivates that behavior, and that's what we're talking about here, right? So, this is one of 5 people's, how many ever team members there are, this is one person's phenomenon that you guys selected. You said, let's run with that one. And now that we've decided, we've all agreed as a team, we're going to use this one. Each team member now goes on their own path and says, you know what, I'm going to explain that. Team member number one is going to explain that from a neurological point of view. And then explain from that perspective. I think there might be something triggered in the way the target's brain that puts them on the defensive when they argue or in a perceived conflict. They may or may not understand what's causing them to respond this way. It could be out of their control. Maybe it's a habit, or maybe they feel threatened and responding defensively out of fear. So that would be the neurological experience of fear is causing them to, in fact, engage in this behavior. And then there's going to be a place on you to put your name, right? So these should be pretty clearly laid out. I think the assignments this semester are going to be nth degree better than last semester because I got some skill. Proton. I hope you're not going to knock over the camera. Crazy cat. All right. So, and then you put the name. So let's repeat that. What do we know? Motivation's new paradigm is which behavior is energized, directed not by single grand cause, but multitude of multi-level co-acting influences. And think about it. What's going to happen with this team assignment? Each team member comes at the same issue from a different perspective. You share that information with each other, and between all of you within the team, you're going to then have a pretty damn good handle on the motivational aspects of the observed phenomenon. And that's the ultimate goal of the assignment. So as expressed in box 2 on the previous slide, right, motivational can be understood at multiple levels: neurological, cognitive, social, etc. Your list of choices comes off that last that slide we looked at. Questions about this? Okay, now here's the deal. This is your first homework assignment, right? And this is kind of to get our feet wet. It gets you guys to understand and to meet each other. You will be engaging with each other. The teams remain fixed throughout the course. I'm not going to change teams, right? So you're all going to work together throughout the course. You're going to get to know each other. If you have questions, what are you going to do? Remember, we have a weekly Zoom session. I believe for this class, it's on Tuesdays? Don't quote me on that. Look at the schedule, right? And there's a separate Zoom section in Carmen. So it provides you with the link. You come to the Zoom session. That is our class session. That is our live class session. I don't lecture in the Zoom session. I answer your questions. So any questions you have, you need to bring to that Zoom session, and then I will help you with them. I will help you with your assignments and give you any clarification you need. So what this means, though, is you got to be Johnny on the spot, and what you have to do is you have to be prepared. You have to have done your reading. You have to have had looked at the assignments, and then before our meeting, so you can make that meeting productive by asking questions that everyone in the class needs the answer to. And that will help you with your assignments. Okay? So that's the way we're going to work it. And again, I don't know who will be grading this particular assignment, either me or the course assistant, because we're going to trade off. I haven't even developed a list of who's going to do what yet. And that's one thing I do. And note how I do this. I will send my course assistant a list and say, hey, here, I propose that I will grade these assignments, and then you are going to grade these other assignments. What do you think? Are you okay with that? Does that seem reasonable? Does that seem fair? Does that seem equitable? Does it meet the requirements for 10 hours a week that you're supposed to put in to earn your graduate student, tuition, etc.? Does it meet that threshold of 10 hours but not exceed it, right? And this is another way that I motivate our course assistant to operate with us, right? Because they're part of it too. So they have a voice, and we're going to talk about the importance of voice later in the course. But bottom line, and I hope you find this course useful, because what I've learned from teaching this course, I can immediately turn around and apply to hopefully enhancing the motivational state of others who participate, be it you guys, the students, or that is the course assistant. And who's the third piece of that equation? Yeah, me. I have to motivate myself as well. So, and one of the things that I urge, we have a lecturers meeting every Tuesday afternoon. All of us lecturers with Dr. Cravens Brown as our leader, right? We get together on Zoom and we talk about whatever we want to talk about. But most of what we talk about is our teaching experience and ideas, right? And we're highly motivated to continuously improve our product. I've had a really good time, and I find speaking with my colleagues about these ideas highly motivating, right? So this is always trying to apply it. So we're at the point now where we got to say goodbye for this lecture. This is the end of lecture 2. And who is that? Well, darned if that doesn't look like Alice. And Alice is saying hey. And I'm saying hey. And I'm going to say goodbye, and hope to see you guys again soon.